Silas kicked the cabin door shut with his boot and stopped moving the second he saw her. The dead coyote slid from his shoulder and hit the floor beside the table with a wet sound. A woman knelt near the stove with her sleeves rolled above her elbows. She scrubbed the floorboards slowly like she belonged there. Dark streaks covered the wood beneath her hands. Silas reached for the rifle hanging beside the doorway. "Who are you?" She kept scrubbing. "You paid $50. "I didn't. You nailed the paper to the church fence." "There wasn't no paper." "There was." She dipped the rag back into the bucket beside her. The water inside looked black. Ash floated across the surface instead of soap bubbles. Silas stared at it, then at the stain near the stove. His chest tightened. The woman finally looked up at him. Thin coat, hollow cheeks, dirt under every fingernail, one eye bruised yellow like it had healed wrong. "You got 5 seconds," he said. "You already gave me 3 days." Silas frowned. "What?" "I've been sleeping outside." He lifted the rifle halfway. "You lying." "Check beside the shed." Silas stepped backward toward the window without taking his eyes off her. Outside, beside the animal shed, a torn canvas lay against the wall with 2 old blankets underneath it. A tin cup rested near the grass. He looked back at her. "You been here 3 days? You were gone. You should left. You should lock the door." Silas said nothing. The stain near the stove kept pulling at his eyes. Most people would have missed it under the dim light, but she had found every inch of it. The blood had settled deep into the cracks between the boards months ago. He never fully got it out. The woman kept scrubbing. "You alone out here?" he asked. "Ain't nobody alone out here. Where's your horse?" "Sold it." "For food?" "For silence." Silas watched her carefully. There was no fear in her voice. That bothered him more than if she had screamed. "You got a name? Maravale? You married?" "Where's your husband?" "Gone." She answered too fast for grief to leave room in the sentence. Silas knew the sound of rehearsed pain. He carried his own. He set the rifle across the table, but kept it close enough to grab. Mara noticed. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. "I got trouble kneeling on my floor. You gonna shoot me for cleaning depends what you saw." She stopped scrubbing then. Slowly, she looked down at the stain beneath her rag. "Blood don't scare me," she said quietly. Silas felt heat rise into his throat. "You don't know what it is. You keep staring at it like you do." The cabin went silent except for the crackle from the stove. Outside, wind rattled loose metal hanging from the fence. Mara went back to work like the conversation had already ended. Silas dragged the coyote toward the back door and tossed it outside. When he stepped back in, she was studying the wall above the fireplace. "That yours?" she asked. A faded photograph sat crooked beside an old lantern. A woman stood beside Silas in the picture, both of them younger and thinner. "My wife? She dead?" "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." Mara nodded once and looked away. No apology, no pity. He respected that more than kindness. He poured water from a rusted kettle into a cup and drank half of it before speaking again. "You steal anything?" "No." "You hungry?" "Yes." "You always answer that straight?" "No." For the first time, Silas almost smiled. It disappeared before it fully formed. He cut stale bread beside the counter and tossed half toward her. Mara caught it one-handed without looking up from the floor. "You trust strangers too easy," she said. "I don't trust you at all." Still fed me. Bread ain't trust. She ate slowly. Every few bites, she kept scrubbing at the boards. The stain was nearly gone now. That unsettled Silas more than seeing it there. As evening settled outside, the cabin darkened into long shadows. Mara finished cleaning and stood carefully, like her body hurt in places she no longer talked about. "That all?" she asked. Silas looked at the clean floor. "You can leave." "I told you already. Ain't got nowhere." "That ain't problem. It becomes your problem when winter comes." "You threatening me?" "You got wolves. Cold. Drunk men passing through. Pick whichever one worries you most." Silas rubbed his jaw hard. "You can sleep in the shed tonight. Then you move on tomorrow." Mara picked up the bucket. "You always this generous? You always this difficult?" "Yes." She carried the bucket outside. Silas watched from the doorway as she dumped the black water near the fence line. Ash spread through the dirt like burnt snow. Night settled over the ranch fast. Silas bolted the cabin door and sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Every few minutes he glanced toward the window. Mara never knocked. She built a small bed beside the barn wall beneath the torn canvas. No fire, no lantern. Just blankets pulled around her shoulders while cold crept across the fields. Silas kept watching anyway. Something about her felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly. Familiar in a way he hated. After midnight, he blew out the lantern and stood near the window again. Moonlight barely touched the shed. Mara lay awake, staring toward the empty field beyond the ranch. Silas tried sitting back down but could not stop looking outside. The woman never moved much. Sometimes she shifted beneath the canvas. Sometimes she just stared toward the dark pasture like she expected somebody to step out of it. The old clock near the stove ticked loud enough to bother him. He opened the door again. "You hear me?" Mara looked over slowly. "What?" "You start wandering around out there, I'll put you down. You say that to every lonely thing on your property? You calling yourself lonely?" "Ain't much else left to call it." He leaned against the doorway. "You got family? Not anymore. What happened?" "People with badges happened." Silas stiffened. Mara studied his face carefully, then pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "You look tired," she said. "So do you." "I stopped sleeping right after the fire." Silas swallowed hard. "What fire?" But Mara had already turned back toward the field. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a loose chain struck metal once, and both of them listened without breathing for seconds. Silas stepped off the porch with the lantern hanging low beside his leg. The chain near the pasture rattled again once, then stopped. Mara stayed beneath the torn canvas without looking at him. Her face remained turned toward the dark field beyond the fence line. "What you say?" She said nothing. Silas moved closer. "You hear me?" Mara finally blinked slowly. "I hear everything out here. That ain't an answer." "Maybe I'm tired of giving answers." The wind shifted through the grass. Somewhere near the old animal pens, a horse stomped against dirt. Silas waited another skint before turning back toward the cabin. He did not sleep much after that. The cabin felt smaller with her outside tonight. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cleaned floorboards. Morning came sharp and gray. Silas walked outside carrying a feed bucket and stopped when he saw the horses crowded against the far fence. None of them would cross the yard toward the well behind the cabin. One mare trembled hard enough to shake the fence posts. "Move," Silas snapped. The mare jerked backward suddenly and sliced her shoulder against broken wire. Blood streaked across the fence rail. The horse screamed and kicked wildly before bolting toward the pasture. Mara stood beside the shed pulling on her boots. "What happened?" "They're acting stupid. Animals usually know first." Silas ignored her and walked toward the well. The old wooden frame leaned slightly to one side now. He could have sworn it stood straighter yesterday. Mara followed several steps behind him in silence. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed at the wood beside the pulley. "They weren't there yesterday." Silas looked where she pointed. Thin symbols had been carved into the wood, jagged marks, deep enough to cut through years of weathered grain. "They've always been there." "No, they haven't." "You calling me a liar? I'm calling you scared." Silas grabbed the rope hanging beside the well and stared downward into the darkness below. Cold air drifted upward against his face. He let go too quickly. Mara watched him carefully. "You scared of holes in the ground?" "I'm scared of things buried wrong." Neither spoke after that. Silas walked back toward the barn, while Mara remained near the well staring at the carved marks. By afternoon she had cleaned the animal troughs and stacked firewood without being asked. Silas pretended not to notice. He found her sitting beside the porch, sharpening a kitchen knife against stone. "You planning to rob me? You planning to stop staring at me? You got attitude for somebody sleeping beside livestock. You got secrets for somebody living alone." Silas sat heavily on the porch step. "You always talk this much, only when men lie badly." Before he could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the road. Sheriff Holt rode into the yard wearing the same gray coat he had worn for years. His horse slowed near the porch, but stopped completely before reaching the well. Holt frowned down at the animal. "What's wrong with him?" Silas stood. "Probably smells blood from the mare." Holt climbed down slowly. Age had thickened his body but not softened his eyes. The sheriff spotted Mara instantly beside the porch rail. "Who's the drifter?" "She works here. She don't look like work." Mara stood without lowering the knife. "You always insult women before breakfast?" Holt ignored her. "You hiring strangers now, Silas?" "She needed money." "She got a last name?" "Mara Vile," she answered herself. Holt finally looked directly at her. Something small changed in his expression. Fear moved quicker than that. Mara stared at the badge pinned to his chest. Then she said quietly, "I know your face." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Don't think we've met. You got one of those faces that survives fires." Silas stepped between them before the silence got worse. "What brings you out here?" Holt kept staring at Mara another second before answering. "Wanted to ask about missing calves near the North Ridge." "You think I stole cattle?" "I think hungry people do strange things." Mara laughed once. "Funny hearing that from a man wearing a badge." Holt looked at Silas again. "You should be careful who you let sleep on your land. She ain't causing trouble." "Not yet." The sheriff climbed back onto his horse too fast, like he suddenly wanted distance more than conversation. He tipped his hat once towards Silas and rode away without another word. His horse refused to pass near the well and nearly pulled sideways trying to avoid it. Mara watched until the sheriff disappeared down the road. "You know him long?" "Too long." "He lies worse than you." Silas rubbed his face. "You don't know anything about Holt. I know he recognized me." That night silence settled heavily across the ranch. Mara stayed outside beside the shed again while Silas sat awake inside the cabin cleaning the same rifle twice. Around 2 in the morning he heard it. Something outside. Not walking, dragging. Slow. Wet. Uneven. Silas grabbed the rifle and moved toward the window. The sound circled the cabin once, then stopped near the back wall. He threw open the door and stepped outside barefoot with the lantern raised high. Nothing waited there. Only darkness and cold dirt. Then he noticed Mara awake beneath the canvas, staring toward the well. "You hear that?" he whispered. She nodded once. "It comes every night." "You been hearing it?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say something?" "You don't strike me as a man who likes hearing truth after dark." The dragging sound returned briefly near the well, then faded again. Morning brought no tracks, no animals torn apart. Nothing except exhaustion hanging beneath Silas's eyes. Mara spent most of the day silent. Near dusk, Silas walked behind the shed and found her crouched beside the dirt drawing shapes with a stick. Not shapes. A badge. The sheriff's badge. She scraped the star shape deeper into the mud while muttering softly under her breath. "What are you doing?" Mara looked up calmly. "Remembering." "From where?" "From the night everything burned." Silas felt his stomach tighten again. After sunset, he noticed Mara missing from beside the shed. He grabbed the lantern and headed toward the well. She knelt beside it perfectly still, one hand resting against the old wood. The carved symbols looked darker now beneath the fading light. Mara tilted her head slightly. "There's somebody under there," she whispered. Silas grabbed her arm hard. "There ain't." She looked at him calmly. "Then why do you keep checking?" Silas released her arm slowly. Mara stayed kneeling beside the well without flinching. The lantern between them shook slightly in his hand, while cold air drifted from the darkness below. "You ask too many questions," he muttered. "You hide too many bodies." His jaw tightened. "There's nobody down there. You keep saying that like prayer fixes things." Silas stepped back from the well first. Mara remained there another moment, listening into the dark before finally standing. Neither of them spoke, walking back toward the cabin. The carved symbols beside the pulley looked deeper now, almost fresh. Rain arrived before sunrise, hard enough to bend the grass flat against the yard. Mara tried sleeping beneath the torn canvas anyway, until water soaked through the blankets. Silas watched from the doorway while she gathered her things without complaint. "You gonna stand there all morning?" she asked. "You planning to drip mud across my floor again? You worried about the floor or the memories in it?" Silas moved aside from the doorway. "Just stay near the stove." Mara entered quietly, carrying her blankets under one arm. The cabin suddenly felt smaller with another person inside it. She sat beside the stove but never removed her coat. Steam rose slowly from the wet fabric. Silas tossed another log into the fire. "You can hang it up." "No." "You cold?" "I've been colder." He noticed she kept both hands buried inside the coat pockets even near the heat, like she was protecting something hidden there. By evening the rain still hammered the roof. Mara leaned against the wall beside the stove with her eyes closed. Silas sat at the table cleaning his rifle again. After nearly an hour he realized she was asleep sitting upright. "You always sleep like that?" Her eyes opened instantly. "You always keep a rifle that close?" "Usually." "Then usually explains itself." Silas almost answered before stopping himself. Something about her made every conversation feel dangerous. Not because she threatened him. Because she listened too carefully. The rain softened outside. Mara stared into the stove fire. "You worked this ranch alone long?" "Long enough." "You got children?" "No." "You sure?" Silas looked at her sharply. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind people avoid." He rubbed both hands across his face. "My wife died years ago." "That ain't what I asked." Silence stretched between them. Mara finally looked away first. After dark she spoke again without warning. "I came from the settlement near the river." Silas froze slightly. "What settlement?" "The burned one." He said nothing. "6 months ago there were 30 families there," she continued. "Then Governor Bell decided the land belonged to somebody richer." Silas stood from the table too quickly. "Bell? You know the name?" "Everybody knows the name." "Not everybody worked for him." The room turned still. Mara studied him carefully now. "You did, didn't you?" Silas walked toward the window. "A long time ago." "What'd you do for him?" "Security." Mara gave a bitter laugh. "That's a clean word for ugly work." Silas stared out into the rain instead of answering. He remembered men with rifles riding through smoke, wagons overturned in mud, women screaming while deputies nailed notices onto doors. "You were there," Mara said softly. "I left before the fires, but you knew." He kept silent. Mara slowly emptied her coat pockets onto the table between them. A cloth bundle, broken watch parts blackened by heat, a small brass button shaped like a flower. Silas looked down carefully. "What's the ashes?" "My husband." The words hollowed the room instantly. Mara unwrapped the cloth slightly. Gray ash rested inside, mixed with tiny white fragments. "The fire burned too hot," she whispered. "There wasn't enough left to bury proper." Silas swallowed hard. "You carry him around?" "Nobody else was going to." He touched the broken watch pieces carefully. "That his too?" He fixed clocks. "And the button?" Mara stared at it for several seconds before answering. "My little girl's coat." Silas stepped back from the table like the objects themselves hurt to look at. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. "No investigation came after the fire?" he asked quietly. Mara laughed again without humor. "Sheriff Holt signed the removal orders himself." Silas closed his eyes briefly. "That son of a bitch. You sound surprised." "I'm not." "Then why defend him?" "I didn't. You keep standing beside men like him anyway." The rain finally stopped near midnight. The silence afterward felt wrong, heavy. Mara remained awake near the stove while Silas sat beside the dark window holding a cup of cold coffee. "There used to be another cabin here," he said suddenly. Mara looked over. "Where?" "Near the well." "What happened to it?" "It burned too." She waited. Silas stared toward the black yard outside. "What happened to them?" "I left before the fire started." "You keep saying things sideways. You keep listening too closely." Mara leaned back against the wall. "That cabin belonged to your family." "No, Bell's people." Silas nodded once. "They used it during removals." Holding place mostly. Holding who? He did not answer. Mara looked toward the window. You hear that? Silas frowned. At first he heard nothing except dripping rainwater from the roof. Then it came again. Cuffing. Wet. Thick. Wrong. Not human close. Silas grabbed the lantern and rifle at the same time. Stay inside. Mara already stood beside him with her own lantern lit. You think I scare easy? I think you don't scare enough. They stepped outside together. Mud sucked at their boots crossing the yard. The coughing stopped completely once they reached the porch steps. Rainwater still dripped from the fence posts and animal pens. Silas raised the lantern higher. Nothing moved, no horse sounds, no wind, nothing. Then Mara pointed downward. Footprints crossed the mud near the well, bare feet, small ones. Silas felt cold spread through his stomach. The tracks led directly toward the well and stopped there. No, he whispered. Mara crouched beside the print silently. Her fingers brushed the edge of one muddy outline. These ain't fresh enough for rain. Silas backed away from the well slowly. Mara reached inside her coat again. This time her fingers caught against the inner lining like something had torn loose. She frowned and pulled hard until a dark object dropped into her palm. A deputy badge, melt nearly black from fire, Sheriff Holt's department, seal still barely visible underneath. Silas stared at the ruined badge without breathing. Mara turned it beneath the lantern light. Burn marks swallowed most of the metal, but the seal remained clear enough to recognize. A piece of dried blood still clung near the pin on the back. He wore this the night they came, Mara said. Holt? He kicked our door open himself. Silas looked toward the well again. You should left this place. Mara closed her hand around the badge. I tried, then why come here? Her eyes settled on the opening behind him. Because something here remembers me too. Silas stared at the burned badge in Mara's hand, while rainwater dripped from the roof behind them. The blackened metal looked warped almost beyond recognition, but the seal was still there beneath the scorch marks. Sheriff Holt's department, same crooked star, same cracked circle around it. You need to leave, Silas said. Too late for that. You don't understand these people. I understand fire. She pushed past him and walked back toward the cabin. Silas remained near the well another moment, staring into the darkness below. The muddy footprints had already started fading into the ground like they had never been there. Before sunrise, horses thundered across the road outside the ranch. Silas woke instantly and grabbed the rifle beside the bed. Mara already stood near the window, with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. You expecting visitors? No. 3 riders entered the yard carrying long guns across their saddles. Dark coats. Silver governor insignias stitched near their collars, even though Governor Bell had died months earlier. The horses slowed near the well and pulled nervously against their reins. The tallest rider spat tobacco into the dirt. Morning, Silas. Silas stepped onto the porch. What do you want? Looking into stolen state property. Mara appeared behind him. You burned women alive for property? The rider smiled without warmth. Must be the drifter, must be the coward. One of the other men lifted a shotgun slightly toward her. Watch your mouth. Mara did not move. Or what? The shotgun rose higher. Silas stepped between them before thinking. She stays. The word surprised even him. Mara looked at his back silently while the riders exchanged glances. You protecting her? The tall rider asked. You trespassing? You forget who owns this county? That badge in your pocket don't mean ownership. The rider's expression hardened. You worked for Bell once. I worked security. Same difference. Silas tightened his grip on the rifle. Bell's dead. Land ain't. The shortest rider looked toward Mara again. We heard she's carrying documents. I'm carrying grief, Mara answered. That can still get you shot. Silas stepped farther off the porch. You done talking? The tall rider laughed once. You always were stupid around women, and you always hid behind bigger men. For a second it looked like somebody might pull a trigger. The horses shifted nervously, snorting hard near the well. One animal suddenly jerked backward so violently it nearly threw its rider. "What the hell's wrong with him?" The short riders snapped. None of the horses would step closer to the well. They circled sideways instead, eyes rolling white. Mara noticed first. "They smell something." "Shut up." "No," she said calmly. "You shut up. You burned families into the dirt and now your horses won't even stand where you buried them." The men went quiet. Silas looked at the riders carefully. Fear had moved into their faces now. Not fear of Mara. Fear of the ranch itself. The tall rider finally peeked toward Silas. "We'll come back with warrants. You do that, and when we do, she comes with us." Mara folded her arms. "Bring more horses next time." The riders turned sharply and rode off without another word. Their animals still fought the rains passing the well. Silas stayed motionless until the sound of hoofbeats disappeared down the road. Mara looked at him. "You surprised yourself. Don't start. You chose a side. I told them to leave. That ain't the same thing." Silas lowered the rifle slowly. "It is for a man like me." The morning passed heavily after that. Mara cleaned dishes inside the cabin while Silas repaired broken fence near the pasture. Neither spoke much until late afternoon when Mara walked toward the well again. "You keep staring at that hole," Silas muttered. "You keep avoiding it." She sat beside the wooden frame and touched one of the carved symbols with her thumb. "This land belonged to my husband's family, didn't it?" Silas looked away too slowly. "How'd you know?" "Because men only kill this hard over money or blood." Silas leaned against the fence post. "Years ago, people heard rumors about silver under the valley. Bells started buying land cheap, and when families refused, he removed them." "You watched it happen." "I watched worse." "Did you stop any of it?" Silas swallowed once. "No." The answer settled between them harder than shouting would have. Mara stood slowly. "My daughter used to collect flowers beside this well." Silas frowned. "You lived here?" "Not in this cabin, down the ridge before the fire." Silas suddenly understood why her face felt familiar from the beginning. Not memory exactly. Guilt recognizing something it buried badly. "I remember a little girl running through the fields," he admitted quietly. Mara looked at him sharply. "She had yellow ribbons." "She hated shoes," Silas said. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mara's anger cracked into grief instead. "You remember her?" Silas nodded once. The sun dropped lower across the pasture. Shadows stretched around the well until it looked deeper than before. That night Mara sat beside the stove, while Silas poured coffee into chipped cups. The cabin stayed quiet longer than usual. Finally Mara spoke. "I didn't come here for revenge." Silas handed her a cup. "Then why?" "Names. Every deputy. Every ranch hand. Every man who touched a torch." Silas sat across from her. "You planning to kill them?" "I want them remembered before they die." Silas stared into his cup. "That enough for you?" "No," she admitted. "But it's honest." The wind outside rattled the loose shutters. Somewhere near the back of the ranch, a dog barked once, then stopped suddenly. Mara looked toward the window. "You ever think dead people stay places?" Silas answered too quickly. "Yes." She studied him carefully. "You see something out here?" "I hear things." "Like what? Dragging?" Mara nodded slowly, like she already knew. Near midnight, Silas stepped outside alone, carrying the lantern. The fields beyond the ranch looked empty under the dark sky. He walked toward the old ridge where the settlement once stood. Then he stopped. Smoke drifted upward from the abandoned field beyond the ranch. Fresh smoke, gray and steady against the night. But nothing was burning. Silas walked farther into the grass until the smell reached him. Wet ash, old wood, the same smell that clung to Mara's coat every time rain touched it. He raised the lantern higher and scanned the empty ridge. No flames. No movement. Still the smoke kept rising from the earth itself. Behind him, back near the cabin, one of the horses began screaming inside the stable. Silas turned toward the sound, breathing hard, and tightened his grip around the lantern handle. Silas walked toward the smoke with the lantern raised high, while Mara followed several steps behind him, through the wet grass. The horses kept screaming back near the stable, but neither of them turned around. Smoke drifted slowly across the abandoned ridge ahead like something breathing beneath the dirt. "You smell that?" Mara asked quietly. "Yeah, it ain't fresh." "No." The closer they moved toward the ridge, the quieter the night became. No insects, no wind. Even the trees stood still. Silas reached the first buried foundation just before dawn touched the horizon. Tall grass covered most of it now, but the stone outline still remained beneath the soil. Mara stopped beside a rusted bed frame half buried in dirt. "Oh, God!" Silas said nothing. The settlement stretched farther than it looked from the ranch. Burned foundations hid beneath weeds and broken fence posts. Pieces of homes rested under layers of ash and mud, like the ground had tried swallowing them whole. Mara crouched slowly beside something small sticking from the dirt. She pulled it free carefully, a melted toy horse. One wheel still attached. Silas looked away, children's bowls, burned lantern glass, a cracked comb. Every few feet another piece surfaced from the ground. Mara walked through the ruins silently until she reached a collapsed chimney leaning sideways beside a dead tree. She froze there completely. "That was ours." Silas stared at the broken chimney. He remembered standing beside it years earlier while men unloaded rifles from wagons. He remembered a little girl laughing nearby with yellow ribbons in her hair. "You lived closer to the ranch than I thought," Mara whispered. Silas swallowed hard. So did everybody else. Mara stepped over blackened boards scattered near the chimney base. "My husband built this porch himself. There ain't much left of it. There wasn't supposed to be." Silas looked across the ruined settlement. Bell wanted the valley emptied before mining crews arrived. Mara turned sharply. "You knew." "I knew enough. You helped him." "I guarded roads, moved families, kept people from coming back." Mara stared at him with open disgust. But there wasn't silver. Silas rubbed dirt across his hands nervously. "No." "Then why kill everybody?" Silas looked toward the burned ridge. "Because fear spreads faster than truth." The words settled heavily between them. Mara walked farther through the ruins without speaking again. Near the edge of the settlement, she kicked against rotted wagon boards hidden beneath weeds. The wood shifted suddenly and collapsed inward. A shallow grave opened beneath it. Mara stumbled backward. Silas rushed forward and froze beside her. Bones rested beneath the dirt. Small ones. Mixed together carelessly, Mara covered her mouth. "Jesus!" Silas crouched slowly. Animal bones mixed with human remains beneath the wagon debris. A child's shoe rested near a cracked skull. "These ain't buried proper," Mara whispered. "No." She looked farther down the ridge. "There's more." They uncovered 3 more shallow graves before dusk. Some held nothing except scraps of clothing and burned buttons. Others held twisted bones impossible to separate cleanly from animal remains. "Why are some empty?" Mara asked. Silas shook his head. "I don't know." He stood heavily from the dirt. After the fire people panicked. Deputies moved bodies fast. "Bodies or evidence?" Silas did not answer. By evening, the air around the settlement felt wrong. Mara kept turning suddenly like somebody had spoken behind her. "You hear that?" she asked. Silas listened carefully. "Hear what?" "Somebody calling names." He heard nothing then, only distant wind crossing the grass. But Mara kept staring into the ruins with growing fear. "My husband's name," she whispered. "I heard it twice." Silas touched her shoulder carefully. "There's nobody here." Before he finished speaking, something moved softly across the ridge behind them. Not footsteps, not voices, just sound carrying grief through the dark. Silas felt it immediately. A pressure in his chest, then he heard it too. Not words, just grief. The sound drifted through the settlement slowly like mourning, trapped inside the ground itself. Mara backed away from the graves with tears running silently down her face. "We need to leave." Silas nodded once. Night had fully settled by the time they reached the ranch again. Lantern light glowed weakly through the cabin windows. Silas stopped when he saw a horse tied badly near the porch. "Halt!" Sheriff Holt stumbled around the side of the cabin, carrying a whiskey bottle nearly empty in his hand. His coat hung open. Mud covered one boot. "You been digging?" Holt slurred. Silas stepped in front of Mara slightly. "What do you want?" Holt pointed drunkenly toward her. "You should let the woman disappear. She ain't yours to bury." Holt laughed harshly. "You don't know what she's carrying around." Mara stepped onto the porch. "I'm carrying names. You carrying trouble. You already brought that years ago." Holt's face tightened. "Careful." "No," Mara snapped. "You be careful." The sheriff drank again before looking toward Silas. "We cleaned that place up best we could." Silas stared at him coldly. "Don't." There were too many corpses. Mara slowly stepped down from the porch. "What did you do?" Holt rubbed his mouth. "We dumped bodies into the well after the fire." Silence hit the yard hard. Mara looked at him like she stopped breathing. "You threw families in there. They were already dead." Mara lunged at him instantly. She slammed Holt backward against the fence and struck him across the face hard enough to split his lip. Holt crashed into the mud trying to grab his revolver, while Mara clawed at his throat with both hands. "You lying bastard!" "Mara," Silas shouted. She was 6 years old. Holt shoved her sideways, but Mara came at him again harder. Silas grabbed her around the waist just before she reached the sheriff's gun. "Let me go. You'll kill him. He killed them first." Holt crawled backward through the mud, terrified now. Real fear. His hands shook, trying to hold the revolver steady. "She ain't right," he yelled at Silas. "You burned children." Mara screamed back. I followed orders. Silas tightened his grip around her while Holt staggered toward his horse. The sheriff nearly missed the saddle climbing up. Before riding off, he looked once toward the well, then away from it immediately. "You stay away from that hole," Holt muttered before disappearing into the dark. Mara stopped fighting against Silas only after the hoofbeats faded completely. She pulled away from him, breathing hard. "You knew." Silas looked down at the mud. "I suspected. That well's full of them." Silas could not answer. Hours later, the ranch sat silent again. Mara stood alone beside the well, holding a lantern over the opening. The light disappeared into darkness without touching bottom. Silas watched from the porch, unable to move. The horses cried softly somewhere beyond the dark. Mara stared downward for a long time before speaking softly. "I know my daughter's down there." Silas walked toward the well slowly, while Mara stood holding the lantern over the darkness below. Her shoulders shook once before going still again. The light trembled across the old stones circling the opening. "Come inside," Silas said quietly. Mara wiped her face hard. "No, you can't stay out here all night. I ain't sleeping under a roof while she's underground." Silas looked toward the well. The smell coming from it had changed since yesterday. Wet rot, mud, something older underneath. Mara. She was 6. He had no answer for that. By dawn, she had already rebuilt her small camp beside the barn wall. Torn canvas, 2 blankets, a lantern hanging from a bent nail. Silas watched her from the cabin doorway while she hammered old boards together to block the wind. "You don't have to sleep out there." "Yes, I do." "You trying to punish yourself?" "No," she looked toward the well. "I'm trying to stay near her." Silas left her alone after that. Days passed strangely around the ranch. The well water turned black by the 3rd morning. Thick streaks floated through every bucket Silas hauled up. One cow refused to drink at all and collapsed near the fence. By afternoon, Mara knelt beside the animal quietly. "It's the water." Silas stared at the dead cow. "Maybe sickness. You keep calling things by smaller names." He buried the animal himself before sunset. Mara watched from the porch steps without speaking. That night, children from neighboring farms rode out with their fathers carrying lanterns. One boy pointed toward the ridge beyond the settlement. "We saw lights moving." His father looked embarrassed. "They've been talking nonsense all week." The boy shook his head hard. There were people walking out there. Silas kept his voice calm. "Ain't nobody out there." But after the families left, he stood outside long after dark, staring toward the ridge anyway. Mara sat beside a small fire near the barn. You saw something too. No, you lying again? Yes. She handed him a tin cup of coffee without another word. Silas sat beside the fire carefully. The silence between them had changed now, less sharp. More tired, Wind moved softly across the ranch. You ever loved somebody right? Mara asked suddenly. Silas stared into the fire. No. You, I loved hard. She paused. Wrong direction. Silas rubbed his hands together against the cold. My wife got sick during winter. Mara listened quietly. Fever came through town. I was gone working security for Belle. You weren't there. No, how long before you came home? 3 days after she died. The fire cracked softly between them. She die alone? Mara asked. Silas nodded once. She left soup warming on the stove before it happened. He swallowed hard. Pot was still there when I walked in. Mara stared into the flames. What'd you do after? Worked more. Why? Didn't know what else to do? That's how men disappear without leaving. Silas looked at her then. The bruise beneath her eye had faded into yellow shadow now. Her face looked older near the firelight, tired in permanent ways. You got anybody left besides your daughter? He asked. No. Parents? Dead? Brothers? Burned. The words landed flat and honest. Far across the valley, church bells rang once through the dark. Silas listened quietly. Holt's probably there again. Church, he's been going every night. Mara almost smiled. Fear finally found him. Next morning, Silas rode into town for supplies and found Sheriff Holt sitting outside the church steps, with a whiskey bottle hidden badly beneath his coat. His eyes looked swollen from lack of sleep. You look terrible, Silas muttered. Holt laughed weakly. You look worse. The church door opened behind them. Father Grady stepped outside carrying a lantern. You can't keep sleeping here, the priest told Holt. I ain't sleeping. You ain't confessing either. Holt stood unevenly. I buried bodies. Father Grady stared at him coldly. You buried truth alive. Same thing. No, the priest answered softly. Truth screams longer. Holt suddenly grabbed Silas by the arm. She's digging around places she shouldn't. Silas pulled away. She's digging graves. That woman brings death with her. No, Silas said quietly. She brought memory. Holt looked shaken by the word itself. He climbed onto his horse too quickly and rode away down the empty road. Father Grady watched him disappear. Whatever happened out there, the priest said, it ain't staying buried anymore. Silas returned to the ranch near dusk. Mara sat beside the barn sharpening a knife again while the sick horses shifted nervously inside the stable. You always sharpening something? He asked. You always asking questions you already know? Silas sat beside her. The priest says Holt's losing his mind. He should've lost it years ago. The wind shifted suddenly. Both horses inside the stable slammed against their stalls at once. Mara stood immediately. Then they saw it, light moving near the ridge. 3 pale lantern glows drifting slowly through the dark field beyond the abandoned settlement. Silas stepped forward. Stay here. No. The lights vanished before either of them crossed half the yard. Nothing remained except darkness. Back near the cabin, the well rope swung slowly by itself. Mara stared at it. You still think this place is empty? Silas did not answer. Later that night, rain threatened again but never came. Mara sat beside her fire wrapped in blankets while Silas watched from the cabin window. Finally, he stepped outside carrying another cup of coffee. You keep doing that, Mara said. Doing what? Looking at me through windows. You keep sleeping outside. Maybe I trust the dark more than walls. Silas handed her the coffee. Why didn't you leave after finding the ranch? Mara held the warm cup carefully between both hands. You really want to know? Yes. She looked toward him quietly. Because you looked ashamed before I even knew your name. Silas felt something tighten hard inside his chest. Nobody had ever described him that clearly before. The fire burned lower between them. Somewhere beyond the barn, water dripped slowly from the well rope into darkness below. Then both of them heard it. A child laughing near the well, high, quick, close. Neither moved, neither spoke. The child's laughter disappeared as suddenly as it came. Mara stayed frozen beside the fire, while Silas stared toward the well without blinking. The rope still swayed lightly above the dark opening. "You hear that before?" Silas whispered. Mara nodded once. "Near the settlement." Neither slept after that. Morning arrived cold and wet. Silas stepped outside, carrying a bucket toward the well, and stopped so hard the water sloshed across his boots. Names covered the mud around the well, dozens of them. Written deep into the wet dirt in crooked lines circling the stones, Mara stepped beside him slowly. Oh, God! Some names Silas recognized instantly. Families from the settlement. Ranch hands. Deputies. Missing children. Then he saw his own name scratched near the edge. Silas Rowe. He backed away from the well. "You do this?" he asked quietly. Mara looked horrified. "No." The names stretched farther than the lantern light reached the night before. Some looked carved by fingers instead of tools. Mara crouched beside one half-covered name. "My neighbor," she whispered. She disappeared after the fire. Silas looked around the empty yard uneasily. Somebody's playing games. Dead people don't play. Word spread before noon, nobody knew how. By afternoon, wagons started arriving slowly at the ranch. First, an old woman carrying framed photographs wrapped in cloth. Then 2 brothers from the northern farms, then widows, ranch workers, quiet men who never usually left their land. They all came carrying pieces of missing people, burned letters, jewelry, boots, children's toys. Mara stood near the porch watching them gather silently around the well. A gray-haired widow stepped forward holding a tiny shoe blackened by smoke. "Found it near the river after the fires," she said softly. Mara took the shoe carefully. Her hands shook. "What was her name?" the widow asked. "Clara." The widow nodded slowly. "Pretty name." More people kept arriving. The ranch turned into something heavy and crowded by late afternoon. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke loudly. An old ranch hand named Eamon finally broke the silence near the stable. "I helped move bodies." Everybody looked toward him. Eamon stared at the dirt. "We thought Bell would protect us." "He protected money," Mara answered. "We were scared. You were obedient." Eamon nodded weakly. "That too." Another man stepped forward. "They told us miners were coming." "There weren't no miners," Silas muttered. The crowd shifted toward him. Silas stood beside the porch with his rifle hanging loose in one hand. "You knew?" somebody asked. Silas looked across the gathered faces. "Yes." Silence settled again. A woman near the fence pointed at him angrily. "You worked for Bell." "I did. You helped remove families." Silas nodded once. "I opened gates while soldiers dragged people out." Nobody moved. A man near the wagon stepped closer. "You kill anybody?" Silas swallowed hard. "I didn't stop them." The honesty hit harder than denial. Several people looked away from him after that. One widow spat into the dirt near his boots. "You're all the same." "No," Mara said quietly. Everyone turned toward her. He stayed. Silas looked at her sharply. "You don't owe me that. I know." The crowd kept growing as evening approached. People walked around the ranch whispering names to each other beside the well. Some cried openly. Others stared into the dark water silently, like they expected answers back. Then Sheriff Holt arrived, drunk again. 2 deputies rode behind him, looking nervous already. Holt climbed off his horse unsteadily. "What the hell is this?" Nobody answered. His eyes moved across the crowd until they landed on Mara. "You're inciting unrest. I'm naming the dead. You're trespassing on state land." The crowd laughed bitterly at that. Holt pointed toward Mara. "You're under arrest." Neither deputy moved. Holt looked back at them. I said, "Arrest her." One deputy lowered his eyes. "No, sir." Holt's face reddened instantly. "You refusing orders?" The deputy swallowed hard. "My cousin disappeared after the fires." The second deputy slowly removed his badge. "My father, too." Holt stared around the ranch and realized nobody stood with him anymore. Power shifted visibly right there in the dirt. Mara stepped toward him. "You remember my daughter?" Holt looked away too fast. "She died with the others." "No." Her voice cut through the yard sharply. "She survived." Silas looked at her. The crowd fell silent again. Mara's eyes stayed locked on Holt. A ranch wife found her hiding in the hills after the fire. Holt's breathing changed. She was burned, Mara whispered, but alive. Nobody moved. You took her away. Holt shook his head quickly. I don't know what you're talking about. You carried her onto your horse wrapped in my blanket. The sheriff backed away a step. She was asking for me. Mara, Silas said softly, but Mara kept going. I searched every church, every orphan house, every graveyard. Tears ran down her face now. Nobody ever saw her again after Holt took her. The crowd exploded all at once. You bastard, you took children? What you do with her? Holt reached for his revolver, but froze, seeing how many people surrounded him now. Men who once feared badges no longer looked afraid. She's lying, Holt shouted. You dumped bodies in wells, Iman yelled back. You burned homes, you stole land. The sheriff stumbled backward toward his horse. Father Grady suddenly appeared near the gate holding a lantern. Tell them the truth, the priest said quietly. Holt looked trapped for the first time in his life. She wasn't supposed to survive, he whispered. The crowd surged forward angrily. Holt climbed onto his horse in panic and kicked hard at the animal. People screamed after him as he rode toward town, toward the church, toward anywhere not filled with memory. Darkness settled over the ranch slowly afterward, but nobody left. Lanterns appeared one by one around the well as grieving families formed a quiet vigil through the night. Some prayed softly. Others read names from old letters and records. Mara sat beside Silas near the porch steps wrapped in blankets. Neither spoke for a long time. The glow from dozens of lanterns reflected against the black water below. You think dead people stay angry forever? Mara finally asked. Silas stared into darkness. No, I think the living do. Mara rested her head back against the porch post. Exhaustion covered her face now more than grief. You still hear the voices? Yes. What do they say? Silas listened toward the well. Nothing. That's worse. Far beyond the ranch, smoke suddenly lifted into the night sky again from the abandoned settlement. But this time flames moved inside it. Real flames, slow shapes drifting between the ruins like lanterns carried by invisible hands. One widow near the well gasped softly. People began standing, one by one, staring toward the ridge. The flames kept moving through the dead settlement without spreading. Like something walking there. Families rushed toward the burning ridge, carrying lanterns and rifles while smoke rolled slowly across the valley. Silas ran beside Mara through the wet grass, as voices echoed ahead of them. The abandoned settlement glowed in the darkness like houses still stood there, but nothing remained. Broken chimneys shined orange. Empty foundations flickered with moving firelight. Shapes drifted between the ruins where no people should have been. A woman behind Silas crossed herself. That ain't natural. One old rancher shook his head hard. It's lantern reflection. No, another whispered. There's people walking in there. Silas stopped near the edge of the settlement, breathing hard. He could see them too now. Figures moving slowly through the flames without burning. Men carrying buckets. Women holding children. Shadows crossing ruined porches that no longer existed. Mara stared into the smoke with tears filling her eyes. That's them. Silas reached for her arm gently. We need Holt. The church bell began ringing wildly from town before she answered. Everybody turned toward the sound. Father Grady rode up moments later on a sweating horse. Holt locked himself inside the church, the priest shouted. He took records from Bell's office. Silas grabbed Mara's wrist. Come on. The church stood lit by lanterns when they arrived. Crowds already filled the street outside yelling Holt's name. Windows had been nailed shut from inside. Silas slammed his shoulder against the front doors. Holt. No answer. Mara stepped forward holding Holt's burned deputy badge. You open this door or I burn the church around you. Locks rattled instantly. The doors cracked open just enough for them to push inside. Sheriff Holt stood near the altar with a revolver in one hand and stacks of old papers scattered around his boots. His face looked gray beneath the lantern light. Empty whiskey bottles covered the pews. "You shouldn't have come," Holt muttered. Silas shut the doors behind them. "You burned children." Holt flinched. "I followed orders." "You dumped them like animals," Mara snapped. "They told us disease would spread. You lying now or then?" Holt rubbed both hands over his face desperately. "You don't understand what it became after the fires." "Then explain it." Silas growled. Holt looked toward the stained church windows. People were screaming everywhere. Bell wanted the valley cleared before outsiders arrived. Bodies stacked faster than we could bury them. Mara stepped closer. "So you threw families into the well. They were already dead." "Not all of them," Silas said quietly. Holt looked at him sharply. The silence answered everything. Mara's voice broke. "How many?" Holt stared at the floor. Some were still breathing. Mara pulled the revolver from beneath her coat instantly. Silas grabbed her arm before she fired. "Let me go. She deserves justice," Silas said. So did they. Outside, the crowd had gone silent, listening through the church doors. Every confession carried clearly into the street. Holt's breathing turned uneven. "We didn't know what else to do." "You knew enough," Mara shouted. Holt suddenly pointed toward Silas. "He worked for Bell, too." Silas stepped forward. "I know. You opened roads for us. I know. You kept families from escaping." Silas nodded once. "I know." The honesty rattled Holt more than anger. "You think confessing fixes this?" "No." "Then why admit it? Because somebody finally has to." Outside, voices erupted furiously after hearing the confession. Men started slamming fists against the church walls. Women screamed missing names into the night. Holt backed away toward the altar in panic. "They'll kill me." Mara's eyes stayed cold. "Good." The sheriff suddenly kicked over a lantern beside the pews. Flames burst across the floorboards instantly. Chios exploded. People outside shoved against the doors while smoke filled the church. Holt fired one wild shot through the ceiling and bolted through a side exit before anybody could stop him. "Holt!" Silas shouted. Mara already ran after him. They burst outside into smoke and confusion. Townspeople rushed toward the burning church carrying buckets, while Holt climbed drunkenly onto his horse near the road. "He's heading to the ranch," Silas yelled. The sheriff rode wildly through the dark valley, with Silas and Mara chasing behind on horseback. Holt kept glancing backward like something followed him besides the living. The closer they rode toward the ranch, the heavier the air became. Smoke still drifted from the abandoned settlement behind them. Ahead, the well rope swung hard in the wind, though no wind touched the grass. Holt reached the ranch first. He stumbled off the horse beside the well, clutching his revolver with shaking hands. Silas and Mara arrived seconds later. "It's over," Silas shouted. Holt laughed weakly. "No, it ain't." Mara stepped toward him slowly. "My daughter." Holt looked toward the well. "She survived 2 days." Mara nearly collapsed hearing it. Silas stared at the sheriff. "What?" "A ranch wife found her hiding under burned boards." Holt's voice cracked badly now. Bell said witnesses grow into accusations. Mara covered her mouth. "No." He ordered it done before soldiers pulled out. Silas moved closer threateningly. "You killed a child?" Holt shook his head fast. "Not me." "Who?" Holt pointed nowhere. "Everywhere, Bell's men." Mara dropped to her knees in the dirt. "She kept asking for her mother," Holt whispered. Silas hit him before he finished speaking. The punch knocked Holt sideways against the well stones. Blood burst across his mouth. Silas grabbed him by the coat and slammed him again harder. "You let them murder her." "We all did." Silas punched him again. Mara remained kneeling motionless nearby while tears ran silently down her face. Holt laughed through blood suddenly. "You think you're different from me?" Silas froze briefly. "You stood beside Bell too." "I know. You watched families burn." "I know. You ain't saving yourself helping her." Silas struck him again with enough force to split his knuckles open. The sheriff stumbled backward blindly near the edge of the well. His boot slipped against wet stone. For 1 second he hung there grabbing at empty air. Then he fell. The scream lasted too long. It echoed upward through the darkness beneath them, while the rope slammed violently against the old wooden frame. Mara slowly stood. Silas stepped toward the opening, breathing hard. The scream continued far below, then stopped abruptly. Silence. The black water beneath settled completely still. Neither of them moved for a long time. Behind the ranch, dawn slowly began touching the valley. Smoke drifted thinner now above the abandoned settlement. The strange flames had disappeared completely. People from town finally reached the ranch, carrying lanterns and weapons, but nobody spoke seeing Mara beside the well. Father Grady removed his hat quietly. "Is he dead?" Silas looked into the darkness below. Yes, nobody celebrated. The valley itself felt exhausted now, empty in a different way. Mara stepped closer to the well, holding her daughter's brass button tightly in one hand. Morning light slowly reached her face as birds began waking somewhere beyond the fields. Silas stood beside her silently. After everything, neither of them seemed to know what came next. Mara stared downward into the black water one final time. Then she whispered softly, "Now they can sleep." Mara stood beside the well, staring into the darkness, after Holt disappeared beneath it. Dawn spread slowly across the valley behind her while lanterns flickered around the ranch yard. Nobody cheered. Nobody prayed. The silence felt heavier than grief itself. Silas stayed close enough to catch her if she fell again. Father Grady removed his hat and looked toward the black water. "We bring ropes," he said quietly. By afternoon, the work began. Men tied cloth around their mouths and lowered themselves carefully into the well, while others hauled buckets upward inch by inch. The smell rising from below turned stomachs immediately. Rot, mud, old fire. Nobody stopped. Families gathered beside the well holding photographs and pieces of clothing, while bones surfaced slowly from the darkness. Tiny bones, broken bones, bones wrapped in scraps of burned fabric. Mara sat near the porch reading names aloud whenever somebody recognized something. Elias Turner. A widow stepped forward crying silently. June Holloway. An old man removed his hat. The work lasted days. Silas barely slept through any of it. His hands split open from pulling ropes. Dirt stayed packed beneath his fingernails, no matter how hard he scrubbed them. Every time somebody lifted another set of remains from the well, he helped carry them toward the growing rows of blankets spread across the ranch. Nobody treated the land like a ranch anymore. It became a mourning ground. Wagons arrived daily carrying ministers, widows, surviving children, and frightened deputies trying to explain themselves. Some men confessed willingly. Others simply left town without speaking again. Governor Bell's remaining political allies vanished after records from the church spread across nearby counties. Signed removal orders, payment records, names of deputies assigned to burn homes. The valley finally saw itself clearly. Quickly, the old order collapsed. Deputies resigned one after another. Ranchers returned stolen land deeds voluntarily. Families crossed back through fields they had been threatened away from years earlier. No gunfights, no speeches, just shame finally losing its hiding places. One afternoon, Silas watched two widows reclaim a farmhouse near the river, while men carried Bell's remaining signs from the property and burned them in silence. Mara stood beside him. "You think any of this fixes it?" "No." "Then why keep doing it?" Silas looked toward the well. Because leaving it buried fixed nothing either. That evening, rain finally washed the smoke smell from the valley. The black water inside the well had already begun clearing slowly. Not clean, just clearer, Mara noticed first. "It's changing." Silas leaned over the stones beside her. Maybe it finally emptied, or maybe it got tired. He almost smiled at that. After sunset, Mara walked toward the cabin, carrying folded blankets beneath one arm. Silas watched from the porch without speaking. She stopped beside the doorway, looking uncertain suddenly. "You cold?" he asked. "No, then why come inside?" Mara glanced toward the barn where she had slept for weeks. "I got tired of living like something unfinished." Silas stepped aside from the doorway quietly. She entered slowly. The cabin looked different now, with lantern light warming the walls instead of hiding them. Mara placed her blankets near the stove and sat at the table without removing her coat. Silas poured coffee into 2 chipped cups. "You always keep this place this quiet?" "Used to." "What changed?" "You." She looked up at him carefully. "That a complaint?" "No." They sat in silence a while, listening to rainwater drip softly from the roof. Finally, Silas spoke again. "I expected punishment my whole life." Mara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "And?" "I never expected forgiveness." She looked toward the stove fire. "This ain't forgiveness. What is it?" "A chance to stop hiding." Silas stared at her for a long moment after that. Nobody had ever offered him anything close to mercy before, without asking for something in return. Outside, the ranch remained crowded with lanterns and quiet voices. Families still camped near the well overnight, waiting for missing names to surface from the dark. But the fear had changed. No more lights drifting through fields. No more dragging sounds outside the cabin at 2 in the morning. The footsteps stopped completely after Holt died. Several nights later, Silas woke automatically expecting to hear them again. Instead, he found only silence beyond the walls. Real silence this time, not the waiting kind. He stepped outside barefoot and looked toward the ridge. Grass had already started returning around parts of the burned settlement. Thin green patches pushing through ash. Mara joined him quietly on the porch. "You hear anything?" she asked. "No, me neither." They stood there together a while under the dark sky. Not close enough to touch, not far enough to feel alone either. Weeks passed slowly after that. Families buried recovered, remains properly, beneath marked stones near the river. Children played near wagons again without lowering their voices. Father Grady reopened the church after repairing the burned floorboards from Holt's fire. The valley carried grief openly now, instead of hiding it underground. One morning, Mara cleaned the cabin windows while Silas repaired fencing near the pasture. The simple sounds of work filled the ranch. Hammer streaks, water buckets, wind moving through fresh grass. Normal things, almost. By sunrise the next day, Mara carried washed clothing outside and hung shirts along a wire line beside the cabin. Morning light spread softly across the valley. Smoke no longer touched the horizon. Silas worked quietly, repairing a broken fence rail nearby. Neither spoke much anymore unless necessary. Words felt less important now. Mara pinned another shirt against the line when something small slipped from her coat pocket into the dirt below. The brass button, her daughter's button. It rested there between patches of grass still stained dark from old rain. Mara stared at it silently. Silas looked over from the fence but said nothing. For a moment it seemed like she might kneel down and pick it up the way she always had before. Carry it close. Hold on to grief because letting go felt too dangerous. Instead, Mara left it where it fell. The wind moved gently across the ranch as she turned away from the button and walked slowly back toward the cabin. Silas watched her disappear through the doorway before returning quietly to the fence in the growing morning light.